Bet on Bears fans, another edition of the Chicago Bears podcast coming your way. Pat the Designer, Courtney Cronin back at it again. Ladies and gentlemen, the new head coach is here, and I'm still excited. I mean, Ben Johnson in the building. I think that this is the one of the biggest things that Chicago has had happen in a little while, going and getting the number one guy. But on top of that, a lot of moves being made quickly today. We got to talk about some of the coaching staff changes that are coming in place and some of the names that may be surprise names popping up for the Chicago Bears defensive coordinator position. All that more in today's episode of the Chicago Bears podcast. Hit that like button, subscribe to the page, leave a 5-star review. Y'all know what to do. Long day yesterday, Courtney.
Yeah.
You get some rest last night. I was still buzzing after a long day.
Yeah, those press conferences are always just like such a whirlwind. And I can only imagine for the people who are getting hired into those positions. So like Ben Johnson does his podium session, and then he goes and does the car wash with some of the TV stations locally, and I think NFL Network too. And then he does another double back session with some of the writers. Like it's a long day. Yeah. And I can only imagine like trying to keep track of everything you've said to make sure that it all lines up with what you said at the podium, will line up with what you said at the, in the small session. But there's a lot of energy around Hallis Hall. And yeah, usually when there's a new hire, they're going, and naturally it's going to feel, okay, clean slate. Everybody can, start over. The team can pick up where they left off after a 5-12 season and move forward. And there's the idea that like you can tell instant success or whatever it's going to be based on a press conference. I don't believe that. Everybody's going to say things that you want to hear them say during a press conference, whether it's Ryan Poles or Ben Johnson or Kevin Warren, like so on and so forth. But I do think that the vibes right now are different than they have been before, because for as much as George McCaskey didn't seem to appreciate the notion that was presented to him, the Bears don't usually get the big fish. They usually don't get the big fish. They don't. And that's a big deal that this time around, their number one candidate, who is not coming cheap, is their guy, and that they're willing to spend, and that they're willing to try to do things differently than they've done in the past and get somebody who, is been proven at one level as an offensive coordinator, as a guru offensively, all the labels that we want to attach to Ben Johnson, and then seeing how that's going to work here, but also not believing that it's going to look directly, a direct carbon copy of what it was in Detroit. And I think that he's articulated that. And that to me was one of the biggest takeaways that happened in the press conference on Wednesday.
Yeah, I mean, I thought that the part that got me the most excited, while everybody else is losing their minds over the Matt LaFleur, taking a shot at Matt LaFleur, saying I did enjoy beating him twice a year. We know how that's going to go. Little pander. There's nothing wrong with a little pander as long as it hits, right? And Packers slander will always hit here in Chicago. The part that I thought was interesting, though, was, and you tell me if you took this a different way, Courtney, but it almost sounds like he's saying, I'm throwing the old playbook out. You're not going to see the same things we ran for Jared Goff for Caleb Williams. We're building this offense for Caleb Williams. And over the last couple of years, has that not been exactly what we've been asking Matt Eberflus's offensive coordinators to do for Justin Fields, for Caleb Williams? You want these guys to be just straight drop back guys, and you don't have the offensive line that can do that. I think building a playbook, not just for Caleb, but for the team that you actually have, is something that we haven't heard a coach say here in Chicago.
Well, you have to. I mean, there's just the common sense factor that the players you have in one place are not going to be the exact same that you had in your previous stop. So Detroit's offense right now would not work in Chicago. Detroit had a better offensive line, by a lot. And it took a long time to build that thing. Can the Bears do it? When I asked him about that yesterday, he said that, that would be his desire to, and he and Ryan Poles are already starting to talk about, needs on this team, that the offensive line has to be better. Okay, so he acknowledges that. Can you take that acknowledgement and put it into action by going to draft players, going to find guys in free agency, doing what you need to do to make that unit better? But is it going to look like it did in Detroit? No, and I don't think it has to. I think that you'll have, this happens with coordinators, head coaches, people who move around from stop to stop. We always say, what does a Ben Johnson offense look like? Same thing, what does it take the playoffs, for example, this weekend? A Vic Fangio defense is a very specific thing. It worked in different places, from Denver to Miami to the Philadelphia Eagles. Yeah. It doesn't look the exact same in every place, but it's it's a system, more or less, that you can pick up one place and then take it somewhere else and work it into who you have on the roster and kind of like the overall philosophy you want to coach with. That's how I think Ben Johnson's going to approach it. And when Caleb said yesterday, and he was talking about like his conversations with Ben Johnson, I thought was really the most interesting part of that to me was he pointed out how, I'm not, he was talking about like, you're your own player. Like not everybody's going to be who, I don't know why he brought up Julio Jones. He just said it, maybe it's just the first player that came to mind. Like I too have visions of that yellow sweater that he wore on, signing day in the mid 2000s. Like, I don't know, it's just like a lasting image. Like he said, not every player is Julio Jones. And I was like, all right, where are you going with that? Then he brought it back to, not everybody's Jared Goff. And like, he's his own quarterback. And here's kind of where it ties into the last staff. For Ben Johnson to know that is something that it doesn't feel like Shane Waldron did. Felt like Shane Waldron was trying to get him to do a lot of the things that he did with Geno Smith. And Geno Smith was an experienced, decade-long veteran. At that point, he had him in Seattle. Caleb was a rookie. You can't ask Caleb Williams, who has some undoing he has to do within his own skill set. Ben Johnson talked about refining that, and Brian Poles did too. You can't expect him to be Jared Goff. And Jared Goff is one of the most efficient passers in the NFL right now. He wasn't always like that. But the goal is to get that same success out of him, whatever it looks like, that same level of success, but not like have like a statistical carbon copy or scheme carbon copy that you can just like translate over and be like, all right, well, Jared ran it this way. This is how I need you to do it. And Caleb said that's how Lincoln Riley coached him. Think about all the great quarterbacks that Lincoln Riley had over his time at Oklahoma and USC. No two players are the same. And I know sometimes it's like, okay, duh, no, everybody knows that. Understanding that and like boiling that down like to your philosophy, you're going to get a lot more coaches who, whether it's arrogance or whether they frankly just cannot coach it another way, are going to try to do things their way and hope that it works with the player that they're tasked with coaching to do it their way. So I think the Bears would have had the foresight to know we can't do this the same way we did it before. We need to be sure that Ben Johnson is what he's talking about, like worth what he's talking about, and being honest about what he's talking about, that he's going to coach Caleb Williams differently than Jared Goff, and that this offense is going to look different than it did in Detroit. Because if you're going in thinking, here's the playbook, here's what made it so successful, here's Stumble Bum, here's all these other things, you're not going to get the same results because it's a different set of players who are at a completely different part of their growth trajectory than a team that was the number one seed in the NFC this year.
Yeah, no. And for me, looking at just starting there, that feels like an improvement. That feels like something. I mean, you bring up, right, Luke Getsy, you bring up Shane Waldron and how they just they wanted to make these guys fit a mold. That's an improvement.
Because it's real, Pat, it's really hard for coaches. And like, this is what we underestimate, thinking, oh, well, you're a coach, you got to adapt. Ben Johnson talked about that at the podium. Like, I'm a coach, I can adapt. You know how hard that is? You have to, that's a completely different skill set as a coach that you have to use. All right, well, this guy can do X, Y, and Z really well. Well, this guy can do P, Q, and F really well. They don't overlap. How do you coach this player to be as successful as the guy who does X, Y, Z? That's really freaking challenging. Yes. It seems simple in theory. Oh, well, you've had other players before. You get them, you've coached different players with different skill sets. Just coach them differently. Acquiesce to how somebody needs something done. Like, no, it's so simple in theory, but it's incredibly difficult to execute.
100%. And that's why, like, when you see the guys like Kevin O'Connell, when you see the guys like Matt LaFleur, you do look at them and go, wow, like that's a really good offensive mind. When you see the Kyle Shanahans, because the quarterbacks that have come into the game outside of their starters haven't been the same kind of guys. Although I guess you could say Sam Darnold kind of the same as Kirk Cousins a little bit. But like for me, looking at just Ben Johnson at this starting point, Caleb Williams is so incredibly different from Jared Goff. He's got skill sets that Jared Goff doesn't have. He's going to have some things that Jared Goff does have. But being able to pick and choose those and fit it to the quarterback, I thought it was so interesting when he said yesterday on Carmen and Yurko that he takes his offensive coaching style from so many different coaches, and that's why he can build a playbook to the coach. Oftentimes we hear coaches come in and say, oh, he's from the Shanahan tree. He's a McVay type of guy. He's a West Coast guy, right? They've got all of these specific nailed down styles that you have to fit into I am excited that Ben Johnson is coming from all of these styles and can take a little bit of each of them and ingrain it into this offense that the Bears are going to run.
Because he doesn't tip it. He's not from like a typical coaching tree. He's had 2 NFL stops in Miami and in Detroit. So his closest tree, obviously, is under Dan Campbell now. Dan Campbell has a coaching tree, which good for him. It's not great right now when you're going to have to replace 2 coordinators, but now you can start your own tree. Dan Campbell came under the Sean Payton, under the Bill Parcells model, and now he's the next branch of that. It's really hard to kind of figure out where Ben Johnson falls in the mix. And who is his influence when he's only been in 2 spots? And, I think it's probably closer to, it's a mix of both, but like obviously the Detroit influence, which of course, when we're talking about the defensive coordinator opening and Dennis Allen's name's popping up for that, there's some others too. Like he was with Aaron Glenn for so many years. Aaron Glenn comes from the Sean Payton, Dennis Allen, like that coaching tree. So you can expect stylistically, it's going to look more like that than a complete departure of it because coaches go with what they know and what they're comfortable with. It's just, it's interesting with Ben Johnson because it's hard to pin down, okay, you're a Shanahan McVay system guy. That's your tree. Like you're running a version of that system.
Right.
In theory, are a lot of these offenses the same and just kind of like, altered from place to place? Sure. But it's hard to like pin him into one specific branch of offensive football because he just doesn't come from that within his coaching world.
Yeah, no, that's the part that makes me look at this as a different situation than what we did have previously with a Matt Eberflus or even with a Matt Nagy coming in, because we knew the excitement around Matt Nagy was he's going to run Andy Reid's system. Mm-hmm. Andy Reid just got this out.
You thought you were getting the Kansas City Chiefs with the Chicago Bears.
Yes.
And I think because Ben Johnson, and I mean, these guys are prepped for this stuff. They know what they have to say at the podium. But the fact that he got out ahead of that and said, this is not going to look like Detroit was maybe the smartest thing he could have done yesterday.
100%.
Because that sets up false expectations. And it also saying, like, if you said, like, oh, nobody would ever come out and say, yeah, I'm bringing my Detroit playbook. Like, it's my way or the highway. Number one, you're going to run off the locker room before you ever have a chance to work with it. Number two, that's showing that you're not like adaptable to the new players that you're going to inherit. And you're setting the players up for failure. If you expect that they're going to be what Jared Goff, David Montgomery, Amon-Ra St. Brown, all the great players up there are doing, the Bears can if it works out, get their own version of it. But it doesn't make sense to pin expectations from a team that's in a completely different spot than the Bears on Chicago and their offense before you've ever had a chance to like work and figure out what you have first and foremost.
Now, we were there yesterday, all 4 of the main guys in attendance, all offensive guys, Caleb Williams, Cole Kmet, DJ Moore. When did Cole sneak in, by the way? I didn't see.
They were all there in the front rows. Interesting.
I saw him in the front.
Caleb talked.
I saw DJ, Rome, and Caleb come in, but Cole is a massive man, and he stood up at the end, and I was like, when the heck did you get here? Either way, those 4 in the front I thought was very telling. Not to say that I don't know what's going to happen with Keenan Allen. It feels like he's not going to be here. Not to say that him not being there is telling of something, but it shows that almost a hunger, almost a like, all right, let's get this thing running. Let's start this now. I want to talk with you today. We got to meet now because this cannot be what it has been in the past. And those 4 guys outside of Rome Odunze, those 3 guys, I guess I should say 3 to 4, all leaders on this team. Hopefully Rome is one this year, but all people who were a part of that leadership council last season, all people who needed to be in the room. And of course, them being on the offensive side means a lot because of him being an offensive coach. Mm-hmm. Did you take anything away from those 4 being there on the day their head coach was brought in and that they moved as a unit essentially?
Yeah, they are going to, all 4 of them are going to be here for a long time. Getting that sort of visual support of, look, the 4 players who are going to make up a lot of yards on your offense are all sitting front row there for Ben Johnson. It's a sign of support. Now, I doubt they were like having meetings with Ben Johnson talking about anything other than, hey, nice to meet you.
Yeah.
This is me. What about you? Like, just, it's a chance for them to get to know each other. And it's just a good sign of solidarity that Caleb Williams was there. Because typically, especially for young quarterbacks and guys who are training for the first time, guys who are on vacation, like much needed break that happens in January for players. they don't usually come back into town to the facility until they have to, which is, for OTAs. So it's very precious time right now until April. And most times players are going to be like, no, I'm training. I'm doing my off-season routine. And for young players like Caleb and Rome, who had no off-season last year, that's critically important. But I think just more than anything else, the seeing that they were there, having Ben Johnson being able to turn to Caleb from the podium and say, like, how excited he is to work with him, but it's going to take more than you, I thought was a very powerful, pointed, calculated message to talk about the rest of the roster, which he said there's a lot of talented players here, but they need more. They need an offensive line. Like, those are things that are so, like, to me, that was him saying, hey, I saw that you took 68 sacks last year. You can be better, but the offensive line can be better too. That's a pretty good sign of support from your play caller, who's going to certainly have some influence on the personnel decisions that this team makes. And Caleb gets to hear from the head coach. I think it would just be different if he was, watching this thing from Florida while he was training, then you feel disconnected from it. Like, to me, the team flying them in shows that that's like, we want you to be a part of this process. We are really trying to do this for you guys. And when he says he wants to build, when Ben Johnson says he wants to calibrate an offense around Caleb Williams, it's good to say that when the guy's in the room so we can hear you, so we can understand you. And I know it seems simple, but it's not. And then having Caleb talk about it afterwards, I thought was important, just because they made this hire in large part because of the quarterback. You don't believe anybody who's like, oh, they just took the job because it's the Bears, whatever else. No, he said having a quarterback helps. Yeah. No shit. Of course it does. And I just, look at the situation in Jacksonville right now. And Ben Johnson turned that job down. I think it's bigger than just, he didn't want to work with Trent Baalke, front office structure. I think he looked at that situation and said, I don't know how much I can fix Trevor Lawrence. Caleb is an unfinished product. He's about to be 2 years into this. He's a draw because he's still a moldable piece of clay versus somebody who's 4 years in and might be a little bit more difficult to break habits with. So to have the guy that, that's got to mean something to Caleb. He came here for me. Yeah, that's important. And to be there to kind of accept that is a huge, huge sign of support, in my opinion.
Well, Courtney, I don't know if you heard on Carmen and Yurko yesterday, but everybody speculates that Ben Johnson just wanted to win in Detroit, but he always wanted to come to Chicago. He always had his eye on this city. He said yesterday on Carmen and Yurko, I think Carm asked him, if the job was available to you last year, would you have taken it? He said no. And I think that has a lot to do with the fact of, let's see what Caleb is. Let's see how
it's that. And he also said that I think there is something to be said about unfinished business. And not everybody has the luxury of thinking, oh, the NFL will be there. I can go in a couple years if I want to. And I asked him about this, and not away from the podium yesterday. Was there any thought given to staying in Detroit? And he came around to it and said that the development of the players there, what they've done on offense, anybody can call that offense now, or whatever it is. Anybody can coach it. He needed the next challenge. I think the loss in the NFC Championship game and seeing what the potential was to improve his own stature as a head coach. We didn't know Jaden Daniels was going to have the best situation or best rookie season maybe ever. So could he have gone to Washington and could that have been him? Sure. But there's anybody can look back at something in hindsight and say, oh, well, I should have done this. I think it was a smart decision for him. If you're not, what he said, I was not emotionally available to do this.
Yeah.
Would you rather have somebody who's not all in, or somebody who's questioning their decision, because that leads to then questioning decisions on the field and maybe not having the right people around you from a support staff structure standpoint? It's going to be interesting to see who he brings in as his coordinators, and then everybody else. Maybe those people weren't available a year before.
Yeah.
So I think it's wise that he went this path. Again, not everybody has that luxury. Sometimes you have to take a head coach opening. Sometimes you have to take the Jets opening like Aaron Glenn did. And it might not work out. It might not work out in Chicago for Ben Johnson, but everything, Bears fans waking up on Thursday feeling pretty good about the state of their team, because for once they got it right the first time, and they didn't have to go back to the drawing board and come up with their plan B or plan C to try to get this thing moving in the right direction. They get to relish in the celebration of we got our guy, when it's not just lip service now. Like Ben Johnson was the number one candidate this cycle of anybody who was going to be a first-time head coach. You can argue that Mike Vrabel was a bigger candidate because the Patriots got him, they had tapped him from the start, whatever. Ben Johnson was the top coordinator candidate. And the Bears, who have come in second, third place to a lot of different teams in the past, didn't overthink it. They said, no, we're not going to worry about our other plans. We're going to interview 17 people. That's fine. But we're going to go after our top guy and not alter our plan unless we cannot get him for whatever reason. And they should feel pretty good about the way that the team handled it, because the brass of this team, Kevin Warren, George McCaskey, Ryan Poles, proved to you that when handled with when tasked with a big decision like this and getting it right, they didn't screw it up.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's just a matter of like, you didn't screw it up. That's a good thing to celebrate.
Yeah. And listen, are we going to sit here and say that every step of the way has been perfect? No. But and I think that for drafting, for some of the personnel decisions, Ryan Poles deserves those daggers. For how long it's taken for the stadium to get here and even have a decision on it, Kevin Warren deserves those daggers. For this, we're talking about the head coaching hire. They deserve nothing but praise. Kevin Warren got the McCaskies in the last 3 months to do things we've never seen a Chicago Bears team do in the history of this organization. Fire a coach in season, fire a coordinator in season, do a legitimate deep dive coaching search. I don't know if I like all the names that were on there. Feels like you were just throwing things out there to try and confuse activity for accomplishment. But at the end of the day, you got to the guy that you wanted and you said, oh, great, all these names, we don't need them anymore. I like the fact that they were convicted in their search, that they were intentional in their search. And at the end of the day, they got the number one guy. Oh, by the way, you got George to open up his checkbook.
Yeah, and that's important. And I know that like he took exception to the question yesterday that he was asked about, they don't typically make these sorts of hires, but this is not a cheap hire. The staff won't be cheap. Ben Johnson's up there talking about experience and how important that's going to be in his coordinators. They're not going to be first-time people that you can shortchange. They're going to have to pay for the staff. And Kevin Warren's saying that you get what you pay for, and that if things are working out, nobody's talking about the finances. He's right. Like, they've got to be willing to not be cheap about this and to not feel like, a junior varsity operation in a lot of different ways when you're, going with like the first-time coordinator, paying them first-time head coach, paying them the price that you usually get, like they did for Matt Eberflus. They got Eberflus on the discount. They're not getting Ben Johnson on a discount, and they shouldn't, because there were it's like the hot person at the dance. Everybody wants to dance with them. Everybody wants to date them. So that's why they're more attractive, because they're, garnering so much more attention. That's Ben Johnson.
Yeah.
He had the Raiders. He had the Jacksonville Jaguars. I mean, for a minute, he was interviewing with the New England Patriots. He had multiple suitors. So, of course, when you're bidding against other teams, and what Ryan Poles told us yesterday, being ready to pounce, being ready to, like, jump on this so you don't miss out, that showed conviction by them, and it showed, like, really proper execution to do whatever it took to get what they wanted. And this doesn't feel like a team that's done that in the past. They've done, like, the whatever it takes sort of approach. Usually it's the whatever it takes up until a certain point. And I mean, we've seen that in free agency decisions. We've seen it before with coaching hires.
Yeah.
You got to give him credit for saying, all right, for real, whatever it takes, because Ben Johnson didn't come cheap.
It's being okay with being uncomfortable. Remember, the report was that George was uncomfortable with the number, but he said, I trust my football guys. Let's do it. Let's spend some money. There's going to be a lot of uncomfortability. Uncomfortability? Is that a word? I feel like that's not a word.
Might be.
I don't. Well, if the person that writes for a living says might be, it's probably not a word. So I'm probably about to get clowned for that. There's going to be a lot of uncomfortableness.
Mm-hmm. I don't know if that's a word either.
A lot of people. All right, Courtney. For a lot of people around this building, Ryan Poles may have to spend money on some players at a price that he may not be as comfortable with. But if you want this to work, you gotta spend that money. There may be coaches that are coming in that are going to cost more. There should be coaches that are coming in that are going to cost more, but you don't go out and pay Ben Johnson what you're paying him, whether we don't know exactly what it is, but if at a minimum it's $13 million, that makes him the 7th highest paid coach in the NFL. You don't pay a guy that much money if you don't want to be a little bit uncomfortable. That shouldn't apply just to the players. I think that applies to the coaches. I think that applies to this front office. I think it's going to continue to apply to George because there's going to be more spending things that are going to come up.
Yeah, and that's roster decisions. That's the staff that they're going to have to assemble here. They're spending, like, these are opportunity costs that they see where you get what you pay for. You got what you paid for in Matt Eberflus, somebody whose leadership, somebody whose, ability to form a staff, the inexperience factor got the best of him. And that's normal. That happens. But if you don't want that to be a valid excuse anymore, then you go above and beyond. Like, if you don't want your dress to fall apart because you put it in the washing machine one time, don't buy it from Temu. Yeah. Go and buy it from a department store. Go and buy it from a boutique. Like, it's simple as like, just don't go on the cheap because something looks good on the outside. And when you find out, when you zero in on it, you see that thing has flaws and red flags all over it. Ben Johnson may have flaws, but to point, and we'll find that out. He might not be the perfect head coach. Who knows? None of us can tell the future. But there's not red flags associated with hiring him, which I think that you had in some of the other candidates that have come through here before. And to ignore those is the reason that they're on to their 19th head coach in franchise history.
Yeah, 100%. Are you saying that the Bears have been buying their coaches off the TikTok shop? We've been TikTok shop got some good stuff, Courtney.
Stuff that's hot in the moment that you have absolutely no idea if it's going to work or if you're going to get multiple uses out of it. You might have just thrown your money away.
Hey, sometimes you got to spend $5 on that shirt, but you're only getting one wear out of it. You know what I mean?
It's not economical. I mean, their past coaching staffs were not economical in a lot of ways because they're firing them after a couple of years.
Oh yeah. They're spending more money in the long term because they're still paying. I mean, the coaching staff this year is going to cost more money because you still got to pay $8 million to Matt Eberflus. So. Mm-hmm. In the long run, if you keep them here for a while, you're looking at saving money on your coaching staff in a way. I thought this was interesting as well because the uncomfortable conversations have already started. By the way, uncomfortability is a word according to Google. I don't know if
I thought it was.
I don't know if that means anything with Google anymore because there's some words I Google. I'm like, that's not a word. Now they've been added to the dictionary. I'm not buying nothing that came after I was born. But no. Adam Johns put this out about some of those uncomfortable conversations that have happened. Interim head coach Thomas Brown, interim OC and wide receivers coach Chris Beatty, offensive line coach Chris Morgan, quarterbacks coach Corey Joseph, and defensive coordinator Eric Washington will not be retained by the Chicago Bears. Chris Morgan's the name that immediately jumps out. He survived a couple of staffs here with the Bears, and there's been continued offensive line issues, and I think that's the one that Bears fans are most going to look at and say, okay, finally a clean slate here. But there was some rumblings of possibly keeping Thomas Brown around as an OC, as somebody who had that relationship with Caleb. Do any of these names not coming back surprise you?
No, they don't. The only one I think that you could look at and say, how is that going to work out, is that Thomas Brown and Caleb did have a good relationship, and I think that there was some hope that they could have retained him and been able just to keep him in that OC role, keep him building with Caleb Williams. But that's on Ben Johnson. Like, you know what I mean? Like, he has the carte blanche now to bring in who he wants to. And if he's got a good OC candidate, then you expect him to go get that guy. And that's, I think, what's important here, that it's not that Thomas Brown did a bad job by any stretch. I mean, there was a lot that went wrong in an impossible set of circumstances for him in those 5 games. But more times than not, this is the reality when so few coaches end up getting carried over onto the next staff. And I wouldn't be surprised if we hear about more coaches on the defensive side of the ball, because there's, they only heard about Eric Washington this morning. I wouldn't be surprised if there are more coaches who may be under contract, may not be, but aren't going to be brought back. I wouldn't be surprised if there's coaches that are brought back. Would be curious to see what happens with Richard Hightower. Special teams coordinator Darren Rizzi's name's been thrown into the mix for the job here. Sometimes it's the best approach you can make to not have any sort of carryover from the previous staff, usually offensive line coaches, because there are so few really reputable ones across the NFL. Sometimes those guys end up getting retained from staff to staff. I mean, Chris Morgan was on Luke Getsy's staff and then got retained onto Shane Waldron's staff. Usually that happens more than not, but I think for a brand new head coach coming in who's on the offensive side of the ball, seeing those departures offensively or not, it was just more of like, when is that going to be announced versus anything else?
No, I thought there were a couple that I looked at. I was pretty sure Chris Morgan was not coming back. I thought Chris Beatty was an interesting one. I actually liked how he was talked about in the building, I should say. Now,
yeah, and he was brought in because he was DJ's receivers coach at Maryland. He obviously had a great relationship with Keenan Allen too, but I think it's also kind of like a way for these coaches then to go latch on somewhere else. Because they're, once all the head coaching spots are filled, then comes the offensive and defensive coordinator cycle and all those other things to see when the position coaches can then fall somewhere else. Because it's a busy month. Like, it's a busy month and a half, really, until the combine when all these staffs are finally set.
Yeah, no, 100%. Now comes the job of trying to bring in the right guys to fill in some of those positions. Some interesting names, I think, that have popped up over this time, and we really haven't gotten a chance to talk about them because we've been running around doing all the coaching stuff. I was on the radio, but the removal of Chris Morgan, does that speak to anything for the possibility of bringing in a guy like Hank Fraley, who has been an offensive line coach, as his offensive coordinator? That's been talked about a little bit, and it seems like there's a relationship there. I know Carmen Vitale said on CHGO that that was something that is being talked about as a major possibility of happening. Is that something that you could see happening here with Ben Johnson?
Yeah, because he won't get blocked from the opportunity. He's an O-line coach in Detroit. You can't block him from an upward trajectory if you're Dan Campbell, because there's rules in place against that. So it wouldn't surprise me if he's the offensive coordinator here. And if that's somebody that, I know Ben Johnson has talked about, like, not wanting to go in and poach Detroit staff and just kind of like pillage the coaching staff, because that's, that stuff comes around in the coaching world as karma. Like, they don't want that to happen. And there's, there might not be like a whole ton of Detroit carryover, but I think that would be a really important one, because you don't want to start out in a brand new stop and not know anybody and just have all these first-time coaches coming with you. Having people you can lean on that you've done this with before, and also knowing how influential he was in the run game. Bears need to get better at running the football. They've been so bad at it. And some of that's personnel, and some of that might be some hard decisions that they have to make with the running back room this offseason. But I would not be surprised if he ends up coming to Chicago. I wouldn't be surprised that there might be some others from that Detroit staff too.
Yeah, no, that's the one thing. I get that he doesn't want to poach everybody away. It's not poaching everybody. Like, he's not taking the defense.
You need kind of your right hand. You need your right hand person.
Yes,
and that very well could be his guy.
And that's what it felt like to me. Now, I will say this: Hank Fraley may, if he is getting offensive coordinator looks, and it does seem like he's getting some other looks around the league. Do you want to call plays, or do you want to be the guy that's kind of the assistant to the guy that's actually calling the plays? I think that's kind of a question mark there for the future of Hank Fraley, but it'll be interesting to see what he ends up doing. Another name that popped up, and I thought this was interesting last night. Now, George was asked about this, and I actually didn't know that coordinators have to go through the Rooney Rule as well.
Yeah, they're all like positioned to do that. Like, that's a league-wide rule.
The Bears have requested Rams assistant head coach and passing game coordinator Aubrey Pleasant, who also spent some time with Ben Johnson in Detroit, to interview for their vacant DC job under Ben Johnson. Sources said a key reason Chris Shula's defense impressed so much late in last season. That's per Ian Rappaport. When you hear a name like Aubrey Pleasant pop up on the market, one, of course, I want everybody to understand this with the Rooney Rule as well. When names like Eddie George and stuff pop up, that means they want head coaching jobs. They're getting in the cycle. It's not just
it
works.
It's not just. I mean, it honestly, that boost his platform by a lot. He's never had a head coaching opportunity in the NFL, like, to actually interview for it. He was part of the Bill Walsh Diversity Coaching Fellowship before. I know it seems like, the Bears just did that to fulfill their Rooney Rule. It's unfortunate that it looks like that, because from what I was told, his interview request came in kind of midway through. It wasn't like it was Saturday night. They're like, shoot, we want to hire Ben Johnson on Monday. Call somebody and see if he can come up. That request came in towards the middle of that process, and he had about a week to prepare. You're not going to ever just like jump right into it. But it works out for Eddie George that he's going to have other people are going to be looking and say, you're a head coach now at Tennessee. So many people forget that he was not just a great player. Like, he's been doing this for 4 years as a head coach in the Ohio Valley Conference. And so good for him. But I think for someone like Aubrey Pleasant, who's it's an interesting name because he's called plays before. Like, he's gotten some of those opportunities during preseason games. Sean McVay has been very, like, amenable to that, like letting his staff, take on those responsibilities, get that experience. So I'm curious to see, because Dennis Allen's name for the DC job has been such a big one, like kind of where everything else falls after that, and some of the other names that are linked to this job.
Yeah, and when I saw the name pop up, the first thing I thought was, okay, this guy's not only been on the offensive side of the ball, he's been on the defensive side of the ball. He's done a lot of things that you would want a DC to do, but is this going big or going home? I don't know if this is the kind of guy that you bring in for this staff, but I think that you could see him coming on to a staff where he does get an opportunity to call plays, because I don't know if this is just a Rooney Rule interview. I think this is a legitimate candidate for an interview because he's got that eye that's been on both sides of the ball, that's been able to play call on both sides of the ball and been able to see kind of how things break down. That's the kind of candidate I want as a defensive coordinator.
Yeah, you would. And like the experience of Dennis Allen, that matters for sure.
100%.
Like that's, he's been
Super
a head
Bowl
coach.
caliber experience.
Yes, like he's been a head coach before. He's been with multiple teams. He's built kind of his own defensive philosophy too, which Aaron Glenn came up under in Detroit or in New Orleans before going to Detroit. There's a lot of good to like about that, but they've got to make sure that, they're fulfilling the Rooney Rule and they're fulfilling, look how detailed they were in getting the head coach hired. They did a lot. I don't think they're going to interview 17 people for offensive and defensive coordinators, but having that same sort of thorough process, you may have tabbed somebody, but like now you get a chance to work with Ryan Poles. Like maybe there's coaches that he has an eye on that he knows from his connection. We talked to both of them yesterday about their Boston College connection. Like there's a lot of mutual threads, threads that kind of like, go to both sides of this, of both of them, that I think that they can lean on each other in the process of trying to find the assistant coaches and then the position coaches to see, okay, is there somebody that that you think would be a good fit that I'm not thinking about? Like that's where those are the initial conversations that happen as you're hiring somebody, once you hire them and once you get to work with, trying to build out his staff now over the next couple of weeks.
What do you expect or either that you're hearing the next domino to fall to be? Because there's a lot of, now with the removal of all of these coaches, you got a lot of pieces that you got to get in here and in a relatively quick amount of time, because you want to get a leg up right after the playoffs is over. You got about 3 weeks left right after the playoffs is over to start free agency, start draft prepping, start having those guys in place.
I would imagine like obviously coordinators within like the next 2.5 weeks. By the combine, everything has to be set. So by the end of February, and that's a month. But, last year they hired Shane Waldron mid-January. It was about like 2 weeks after the season ended. And then it took him about 2.5 weeks to assemble his staff fully. So I would imagine that like you hire the OC, who, if you're calling the plays, as Ben Johnson told us he was going to continue to, nobody thought he wasn't. You probably have you probably already know the guys that you want in that position, where it's like you got to find a defensive coordinator that you entrust to then like hire a whole staff. And that takes time, but I would imagine in the next like 2.5 weeks we'll know.
Yeah, it's definitely going to be very interesting to see what the Bears are going to do here next. I'm excited. I think there's a lot of good moves that are on the table, and dare I say the Bears are doing this differently, and that's a good feeling being a Bears fan. I'm very cautiously optimistic, Courtney. I don't think I can go in on the full cup of Kool-Aid just yet. I'm gonna just take a swig, see if there's enough sugar in it. But for Courtney Cronin, it's your boy Pat the Designer back at it again. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. How do you like some of the names that are being looked at? Dennis Allen, Aubrey Pleasant. Like there's so many names that are going to be popping up on this list. Stay tapped in. Let us know in the comments below. It's your boy Pat the Designer back at it again. Y'all stay safe out there, Chicago. Bear down. One love. Peace.